Those of you who were here 2 evenings ago will remember that I explained the revolutionary tendencies in Spinoza's work, both those aspects of Spinoza's work that could be regarded as revolutionary in relation to the Jewish community, but more especially those aspects of Spinoza's thought that could be regarded as revolutionary as regards society and politics in general. I put a particular emphasis on the fact that in early modern times, in contrast to the world, our modern world, what we're used to since the end of the 19th century, let's say, or early 20th century, society was extremely stratified, and although the Jews were certainly the most marginalized, ghettoized, and the group most subject to disabilities and exclusions from most areas of society, one has to remember that actually the majority of society in one way or another were placed in a subordinate position in relation to aristocracies and oligarchies, and depended which group it was, but they had no sense of universal and equal human rights, such as tends to guide our perceptions of what's right and wrong in terms of society and politics today. And their sense in early modern times, in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, most people's sense of what was right and proper was very heavily influenced by, on the one hand, social stratification. So it was right that most of society deferred to those who belonged to the aristocracy, but there was also the idea that this was a God-given social hierarchy that people had to defer to and ought to defer to, and the sense that also that religion and theology, as it were, underwrote or cemented this social and political system. Now, when we get onto the subject of Jewish emancipation, we see, I think we're at the very heart, at the very core of the issues involved in how are you going to transform the stratified society of early modern times, which puts most groups in one way or another into positions of subordination, and the Jews in particular into a highly marginalized and discriminated against social situation. How do you transform this and create a world which is based on universal and equal rights, which is obviously from every social, political and theological point of view so entirely different a concept and so entirely different a reality that it is going to require a total revolution in people's thinking, or at least in the thinking of groups strong enough to challenge and change the system for things to be transformed in such a comprehensive manner. So how does that come about? So when we're talking about Jewish emancipation, we're talking about certainly one of the most important, you could argue actually the most important transformation in Jewish history since let's say the exile from the Holy Land in Roman times. Since then, perhaps the biggest upheaval there's been, or the biggest transformation there's been in Jewish history, has been the process of emancipation from the late 18th century through the 19th century, which was long, which was complex, which was arduous, and which was actually never really complete when you look at the details. At least in a lot of countries it wasn't complete. And but my point is that this is not only an enormous transformation in Jewish history, but that one cannot understand this enormous transformation in Jewish history without putting it in the wider setting of the general question of how we move from early modern stratified society to the modern world of universal and equal rights, this being such an enormous and profound transformation. Now, you could, of course, say, well, there's the Enlightenment. Didn't that change the picture dramatically? Well, of course, it did up to a point, but things start to get complicated when you look more closely at what actually happened in the 18th century. Until, I would say, the work of Arthur Hertzberg and researchers in the 1980s and 1990s, historians were not sufficiently aware of the fact that most of the mainstream Enlightenment, and here Voltaire is certainly the best example, were actually not very interested in the question of the Jews and didn't have very much sympathy for the Jews, were not at all concerned with the problem of repression and discrimination and marginalization of Jewish life, exclusion of the Jews from most corridors and most aspects of European society. This didn't seem to be a problem in the minds of Voltaire and the mainstream Enlightenment, generally speaking. And some of these individuals, including Voltaire, were certainly susceptible to a certain degree of personal anti-Semitism, which has been remarked on by a number of scholars. A former student of mine who wrote a very good book on 18th century attitudes, social and cultural attitudes in relation to Voltaire, Adam Sutcliffe wrote that referred to the problem of Voltaire's sustained, disparaging and dismissive attitude to Judaism and the Jews. And I think that absolutely does sum up Voltaire's attitude. So if you imagined, you could say, well, if we took the Enlightenment out of the equation altogether, surely, given all the trends, the economic and social trends of modernity, look at industrialization, look at urbanization, all the things, these very fundamental social transformations, wouldn't the old pattern have disintegrated in any case, and the Jews been integrated into Western society? Well, yes, perhaps, but then the whole thing might have happened a century later and in a rather different way. Remember that in Britain, I think Britain was still basically an aristocratic society down to World War II, believe it or not. But even if you look at it just in terms of universal male suffrage, don't forget that it's not till 1918 that the principle that you could not formally and legally and as part of your public institutionalization, public institutions, declare that sections of the population are innately and inherently of inferior status to other parts of society. This was perfectly acceptable through the 19th century, by and large, in Europe. In the United States, it was much more contested, but even in the United States, remember, the democratic revolution is still being resisted. And I'm not just referring to the southern states, but in some of the northern states, there are still a lot of fights and arguments about this, right down to the 1840s. So even in the United States, it was not an automatic or an easy process, but it was a much more difficult process in more stratified Europe. Or if those countries that were least susceptible to Enlightenment ideas, the old patterns of thinking about both the social stratification and the theology that was linked to it remained more or less intact in places where the Enlightenment hadn't penetrated very strongly. So we can imagine, yes, it would have changed eventually. Actually, it took until 1923 in the case of Romania. Under the Constitution of 1878, all adult men had the vote if they were Christians, but people accepted that theology is fundamental to our conception of what society is and how politics works. That the Jews are stateless people who cannot be regarded as participants in Romanian society was taken for granted, and it took till 1923 to change that. So we shouldn't think that the Enlightenment attack, which I'm going to try to delineate in that part of the Enlightenment that undertook to change this, in the 18th century, we shouldn't regard it as a small matter. On the contrary, we have to regard it as absolutely crucial and formative in Jewish history and in general history, and something which has been far too little really profiled, delineated, and got across to audiences and to scholarship itself, for that matter. So there is a general Enlightenment that didn't take any interest in the Jews and didn't do anything really to contribute to the process of Jewish emancipation. And I would include most of the famous 18th century Enlighteners, Montesquieu and Adam Smith and David Hume and so on. None of these figures were particularly interested in the subject of the Jews, though not many of them had as pronounced an anti-Semitic tendency as Voltaire had. Now, that part of the Enlightenment that goes back to what I was talking about 2 evenings ago, the Radical Enlightenment beginnings lie in the Dutch Golden Age in the second half of the 17th century, not just in Spinoza, as I emphasized, but in a whole group around Spinoza, at least 4 others of whom were quite significant political thinkers, Johann and Peter de la Cour, Lodewijk Meyer, and Franciscus van den Enden. Together with Spinoza, and Spinoza is the only one of the group who is a great philosopher. Certainly he developed and refined the most important political as well as other ethical and other ideas that they were concerned with to a higher, a more elevated and also more coherent and integrated level. But it wasn't a one-way process. He was learning from them as well as they were taking things from him, and some aspects, especially the general will idea, which I mentioned in the lecture 2 evenings ago, were more strongly affirmed by 1 or 2 of the others of those writers than by Spinoza himself. So it's not just Spinoza, you have to think of it as a group that originated the Radical Enlightenment. Now, something that English historians, unfortunately, are rather reluctant to accept, but which little by little is being more and more demonstrated in recent years, was a very interesting article by a man called Ian Lisk a year or 2 ago, which has just been published, showing that historians in general have greatly underestimated the extent to which John Toland, who's perhaps the first major figure really to initiate this radical enlightenment tendency in England, is influenced by Spinoza. He said it's really slightly shocking to see this. He said even Jonathan Israel has underestimated the extent to which, I think he was right actually, underestimated the extent to which Toland is in fact a covert Spinozist, because he demonstrated it's not just in the more obvious points, but also in a lot of minor details and so on. He demonstrated in a very interesting way. Toland's borrowings from Spinoza are very extensive and much more extensive than most scholars have been willing to admit. Now, you must say, well, what's the relevance of that to my theme? You'll see very quickly, because Toland was, in fact, the very first Enlightenment writer to talk about the problem of Jewish marginalization and ghettoization and the difficulty, the challenge of integrating Jews and Judaism and Jewish life into the Western world in a completely new way, quite different from the sort of debates that had gone on earlier. The most famous is, of course, Manasseh ben Israel in his submissions to Oliver Cromwell, his request to the English Parliament that the Jews be allowed to return to England and settle once again in England after their medieval expulsion. And there are other examples, Italian and German examples of these kind of pleas that the Jews, it can be useful to societies. They should be perhaps readmitted to some of the places that they'd been expelled from. But the logic, I'll come back to this a little bit further on, but what we might call the Manasseh ben Israel logic of Jewish requests to European governments in the 17th century didn't dispute that the Jews were quite separate from the societies among whom they lived, that they did not enjoy or share or deserve the same rights or access to most areas of life or society, and certainly not to public office or politics, no question of that, but that they were useful in trade. This was where the Jews had something to offer. They traded with so many places. Their trading systems were so far-flung and so international. They could help develop colonial trade, Mediterranean trade with Muslim countries. There are lots of ways that the Jews could contribute to the expansion of, for example, English trade in the 17th century. Won't Cromwell readmit the Jews because the Jews can be useful to English society? So that would be what you might call the pre-Enlightenment logic of Jewish requests and submissions for readmission to Western society. Now, for the first time in 1714, you're getting a completely different kind of logic, a totally different argument, which has absolutely nothing to do with the Manasseh ben Israel approach. This is another scorecard entirely, and we are in an entirely different world. What he's talking about in this very interesting pamphlet to 1714 is the the inherent and essential equality of the Jews with other people and the injustice of the marginalization to which they've been subjected. This is a completely different kind of argument. The plight of the Jews came to be conceived, I'm arguing, by radicals, first by Spinoza, but now in the English context by Toland, as the marginalization and special and the repression to which the Jews have been subjected to a degree beyond that of any other group in European society is the result, he argues, of a combined of a political theological system of oppression, which he analyzes in this tract in a very interesting way. And it explains, Toland argues, it explains why their most, I'm now quoting from this tract, their most inveterate enemies were the priests who devoutly offered up those he's been talking about the victims of the Crusades and the victims of medieval popular anti-Jewish outbreaks. And he says it's the priests who devoutly offered up those human sacrifices, not only to share their goods with the rapacious prince, but also to acquire the reputation of zeal and sanctity among the credulous vulgar. Everything, in short, though ever so false or impossible, served for a handle good enough to rifle or expel or slaughter the Jews. And what Toland offers here is a highly unorthodox and unsettling analysis of the Jewish question, and it was a challenge which could by no means be answered by pointing to, as most of the opponents of Jewish emancipation throughout the 18th century, and for that matter in the early 19th century, you're going to hear, one hears this again and again in those adversaries who are trying to resist this process of Jewish emancipation once it starts to gain more momentum. They always say, well, yes, but the Jews are so different from our people, they're inherently different. Look at the shape of their society. The Jews have a kind of innate difference. They don't concern themselves with most of the occupations that other peoples concern themselves with. All they think about is trade and business. They don't do anything else. And the Jews are just a different kind of people. So Toland takes up this discussion in a most interesting way. And he says that the arguments he's offering can by no means be answered by pointing to Jewish separateness, their peculiarities as a people, or their over-concentration on trade. He argues that nothing he said is disproved by such claims because their general concern, their general occupation of exchange, as he puts it, he means their over-concentration on trade and business, is something they are driven to out of necessity. And the Jews have not, in fact, adopted the style of life to which they had been squeezed by the repression of the centuries and what they'd experienced in Europe. They hadn't chosen this from choice or inclination. He says, originally in biblical times, the Hebrews were shepherds, farmers, and builders, once accorded equality by modern society, with all those disabilities removed. He had no doubt that the Jews would once again transfer into building, farming, and all sorts of improvement like other people. And so I think it's reasonable to call Toland Spinoza's lifelong disciple, though the older books always go on about how Toland is a follower of Locke. In fact, he's an anti-Lockean, and it's quite obvious that he's an anti-Lockean when you look at the specific philosophical moves that he's making. His attack on supra-rationem, for example, the principle that all reality is divided into two parts. There's the physical reality, and then there's the truth which is above our reason, which explains how the Christian mysteries are possible. That's fundamental to Locke. That is completely eliminated in Toland, just as in Spinoza. It's just another example of Toland's Spinozism. So Toland is a Spinozist anti-Lockean. The anti-Lockeanism is important, although it's not been generally recognized. And at least not till recently. I think now it's really impossible to go on with this Toland is following in Locke's footsteps kind of thing, because it's become absurd, and it's something that really occludes and obscures what is actually happening here, because the radicality of Toland's thought is rooted in his anti-Lockeanism. So this is why the philosophical classification has been very poor in this case and really needs urgently to be changed, because it helps to occlude the historical reality, which is such an important one. And in other words, in Toland's eyes, as in Spinoza's, at bottom the Jews are not a people apart, neither specially elected nor separate in any meaningful way. They are, on the contrary, just like everybody else, no better and no worse. It is this combination of anti-monarchism and anti-ecclesiasticism in Toland's laying the blame for the plight of the Jews on past society, ideas and institutions generally, which constitutes the heart of his Radical Enlightenment stance. In addition, while depicting Jewish history as merely part of universal history, the comprehensively subversive Toland presents the Mosaic law, as I think Spinoza does a little bit, though we were discussing this at the conference yesterday, and I think the feeling was that it doesn't come out very strongly, perhaps, in Spinoza. I think it was possibly slightly underestimated. Anyway, it comes out more strongly in Toland, where the Mosaic law is represented as a great republican landmark of lasting significance for all humanity, and he adds it to the series of great ancient proto-republican legal codes, like those of Solon, Lycurgus, and Numa. In fact, Moses should now be reclassified, says Toland, as a pantheist, or, in more recent language, a Spinozist, quoting. He actually says that we should reclassify Moses as a Spinozist. This is one of many pretty direct hints in Toland that he's a Spinozist. The ideas of the credulous vulgar and the clergy, as Toland depicts them, not only deserve to be, but must be thoroughly despised and rejected, indeed firmly rejected by anyone with any true sense of how things are and any real sense of justice. However, the power of the multitude and the clergy to block the transformation Radical Enlighteners had in mind, and the emergence of a secular society along the lines that Toland is suggesting, was definitely not to be underestimated, and in fact it represented an enormous challenge. I'm not ignorant, added Toland, how much the world is governed by prejudices, and how far some who would not be counted of the vulgar are yet swayed by vulgar errors. This is very much like Spinoza's, including Spinoza's concept of the multitude includes the aristocrats, the clergy, and the kings, everybody who thinks in a conventional or ordinary way and accepts the existing state of things is part of the multitude. But you, as I was saying in the lecture 2 days ago, but you can be a fishmonger and a grocer, or you can have any occupation, no matter how lowly, but if you've got a shrewd understanding of what's going on in this world and you really understand how things go, then you're not part of the multitude. So the multitude are the people whose ideas are all wrong, and Toland really is sharing this kind of this kind of approach. And in this respect also, he's very much of a Spinozist. So the fight was on to rescue the Jews from their enforced marginality as part, and this as part of a wider struggle to secularize and democratize and republicanize modern society. It was a battle, as some later lamented, that was to prove long, bitter, and ferociously arduous and inconclusive. A battle against the false ideas of the common people, but false ideas sanctioned by government, churches, and elites. Now, although you have Toland and one or two other hints of what's to come in the early 18th century, you see he died in 1722, he's very much a man of the early 18th century. It's not till the 1780s that one can speak of the Radical Enlightenment's movement to emancipate the Jews becoming important enough to be a significant political initiative, which is really now being commented on a great deal internationally. And the man who brought it to that state of affairs was Christian Wilhelm Dohm, and this is the German title, über die bürgerliche Verbesserung der Juden, about the civil improvement of the Jews. That's what he called his tract. And it is this is the second part, 1783. The first version came out in 1781. And more or less the same time as the reforms going on in Austria, the Toleranzpatent of the Emperor Joseph II, some of the enlightened despots were inclined to start to go some way in this process towards Jewish emancipation. The idea of linguistic integration, making the Jews send their children to the same schools as others, imposing a general religious toleration. It was beginning to catch on in some parts of Europe. That's true. But you must remember that it is equally true that other enlightened despots, Frederick the Great, for example, in Prussia, was not at all sympathetic to this sort of thing. He had a very strong anti-Jewish attitude, and Catherine the Great in Russia was not very different, and didn't actually take any steps or measures in the direction of Jewish emancipation. When Diderot was not a great traveler, but he did go to Russia, and he did try to give the Empress Catherine some advice, not very successfully. But one of the things he asked her about was why she didn't do anything to change the marginalization of Jewish life in Russia. Now, why is Dohm so important? Well, it's partly because this pamphlet happened. He was encouraged to publish this and did it behind the scenes in alliance with the most important of all the Jewish reformers of the Enlightenment, Moses Mendelssohn. So this is partly the result of an initiative of Moses Mendelssohn. That is certainly part of it. But it's the impact that it had internationally in many countries, not only in the German-speaking world. I'll say something about how it came to be taken up in the French-speaking world in a moment. But even across the Atlantic, it was noticed. It had there was a huge discussion about it among the Sephardim in Suriname in the 1780s, and David Nassi, and they were enormously excited because people highly literate and educated, those Jews who were able to read what was coming out in German and French at this time realized at once that something very major was happening that was going to transform the Jewish world, that this was very important. Now, Dohm he's not quite a Toland. He's not as cheeky or as bold as Toland. He was a Prussian official. He had to respect the fact that he had to, in public, appear. He was a very skillful diplomat who wrote on other subjects as well as the Jews. But from the private correspondence, some of which I've been reading, of Christian Wilhelm Dohm, the important thing from the point of view of my argument this evening is that Dohm is an anti-Christian. He doesn't like Christianity. He especially greatly dislikes the role of the churches and the way they have shaped social attitudes over the centuries. He tells privately, because it's very important for him that he shouldn't ruin his reputation as a Prussian official, but to close friends, he tells them he's a deist. He doesn't agree with Christianity. And he also, although he's the servant of Frederick the Great in a sense, he does admit in his in private correspondence that he's a Republican. He doesn't like all these kings and monarchy and aristocracy. Keep it quiet. But what I want to say is it's Republicans who reject the ecclesiastical history of Europe, who are in a position mentally to argue that the reason why there is one of the most prominent features of this pamphlet, as in the Toland pamphlet, is that the over-concentration of Jewish society on trade and business is not the result of some innate characteristic or racial characteristic of the Jewish people. It's the result of centuries of repression, oppression, and marginalization and exclusion from the majority of occupations. And Dohm is not asserting this quite as uncompromisingly, let's say, as Toland. And he does say that through education, that there are aspects of Jewish society that need improving, and this process of improvement will happen by the state making educating Jewish children together with the other children, so that more of a social integration takes place, and once the disabilities and exclusions and the guild system are changed, then he expects that this overconcentration on trade to end and Jews to go into all the crafts and skills and occupations and all the opportunities that would be available to them as part of general society. Now, Moses Mendelssohn, as I say, was very important in driving the whole process of Jewish emancipation in the late 18th century. I just thought that these two quotes from Dohm would give you a sense of why a particular alliance between Mendelssohn and Dohm was likely to happen. What was special about this man and his views which would make it possible for him to represent the Jewish case in a completely different way? So he sees government as bringing all these, in achieving a greater union between the different elements of society. And the idea of a civil happiness and in a well-ordered state as being something that has to be generalized within that society is very basic to Dohm. And this means that while everyone should be free to practice what religion they want, that the tendency of churches to create institutional enclaves which are separate from each other is something that the state must undertake to put an end to. The Jew is even more man than Jew, and how would it be possible for him not to love a state in which he could freely enjoy that freedom? Now, I've said quite a lot about how the ecclesiastical organizations are often the target of attack of these radical enlighteners, and certainly they are. But at this point, we need to mention that it certainly isn't only the Christian ecclesiastical organizations which are under attack. Of course, it's implied in what Dohm is saying there. And very soon, this accusation was leveled against Mendelssohn as well, that the reforms, the kind of Jewish enlightenment that he envisages, and which he's encouraging, and which is inspiring in so many ways, not least through his alliance with Dohm, is going to have the effect of weakening Jewish communal separateness and autonomy under rabbinic authority, and that once the rabbis, there's already several attacks in the 1780s on Mendelssohn, let alone the principle of Jewish emancipation, from very prominent figures, that Rabbi Landau in Prague, very prominent in Central Europe and in Poland, very prominent rabbinic figures, are starting already in the 1780s to get rather uneasy about this whole business of Jewish emancipation. Actually, although he was a great success in the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world through most of his career, in his last few years, he had a rather unhappy final phase. I'd say the last 3 or 4 years of Mendelssohn's life were very contested, partly because of the advent of rabbinic and Jewish conservative opposition to the kind of changes which he was suggesting, and on the other hand, the rising opposition to what I call, I wouldn't say that, I explained this in the lecture 2 evenings ago, that Mendelssohn had to be extremely careful in his efforts to recover Spinoza to some extent. Manasseh ben Israel's 17th century pamphlet was translated into German and published by Mendelssohn in 1780 with a very interesting preface where he sets out his views on civil society, on toleration, on the role of the Jews. Of course, this is another way of promoting Jewish emancipation and toleration. Several of the ideas are very Spinozistic. It's also a way of promoting a Spinozistic retrieval into a new kind of Jewish attitude to politics and society. But at the same time, an enormous controversy blew up in 1784, 5, 6, the last 3 years of his life, instigated in particular by a man called Jacobi, who I mentioned 2 evenings the other evening, and who realized that by attacking the Spinozist element which is very strong in Mendelssohn's Christian friend or non-Jewish friend Lessing, and in several others of the leading German writers and thinkers, not least in Goethe, who was very preoccupied with Spinoza in this period, by reviving the general society, Christianity, our institutions, our governments, utterly condemned Spinoza and Spinozism in every respect. And this point, which had, of course, been going on for more than a century by this time, is reaffirmed in German society very powerfully and in a way which very seriously compromised Lessing's reputation and could have, and I think in a way did damage Moses Mendelssohn too, because his standing in non-Jewish society was actually much reduced immediately after his death, and I think partly because of this. So it was tricky territory, but the full force of Europe, its institutions, its kings, its aristocracies, its common people, its churches, totally reject these Spinozistic principles. This is reaffirmed very, very strongly just at that time. But the message of Mendelssohn and of Dohm was by no means pushed away out of sight. There were a number, Dohm had a lot of friends among the advanced radical deistic clique of the German Enlightenment. This man was very much of a Spinozist, he wrote a biography of Spinoza. He was the leading Turkologist in Germany. In fact, he became a Prussian diplomat. He was sort of envoy in Constantinople for a few years. He was very learned in Turkish and in a whole range of other Oriental languages. A very interesting figure of the period. But I mention him here as a Spinozist, as a radical enlightener, as a great enemy of the existing framework of society, and as an ally, very much an ally and supporter of his friend Dohm. Well, I mentioned his biography, Spinoza, Benedict von Spinoza, Nach Leben und Lehren, Bessel 1783, which is actually the first rather sympathetic work by a German writer describing the life and the teachings of Spinoza, so it has a certain historical and biographical importance. But I just want to I don't know why Dietz is totally forgotten. It's almost never mentioned. This is a bit of a mystery to me. Perhaps somebody here can throw some light on that, because his 1781 tract, the Apologie der Duldung und Pressefreiheit, is the first general plea on the grounds that it is a benefit to society for press freedom, published in modern German, which you'd think would be pretty important. Press freedom, after all, is not exactly an insignificant thing in our conception of what democratic modernity is. Since Mr. Dietz published the first tract, completely uncompromising, it doesn't matter what you say about theology, complete freedom of expression is a benefit to society generally and to the sciences. And he uses very Spinozistic arguments in explaining why press freedom is much better than censorship. And that's 1781, and surely rather important. I can't understand why Dietz is not mentioned. Oh, here's Manasseh, and there is this is the text I referred to, of course, that was published in London. And this is the text that appeared in German at this time with such an interesting preface. Now, the German text of Dohm's pamphlet, published in 1781, was reviewed at length for the first time in a French journal, actually a French journal published in London, by Jacques-Pierre Brissot, who was to be one of the leaders of the French Revolution. Brissot, you see, who was a great ally of the first major, very explicit and affirmative democratic, republican, radical of real importance, writing in French, is the philosopher Condorcet, another figure who, Condorcet, of course, is much more famous than Dietz, and probably everyone here has heard of him. Still, my feeling is that Condorcet's importance is never stressed enough by historians. He seems to me an absolutely crucial figure, because he's the first one in France who said, right now, it's never mind about kings, never mind about aristocrats, never mind about clergymen, universal and equal rights is the rule. The American Revolution is a great thing. This is maybe that's the one reason why the French don't quite emphasize him as much as they should. He said the Americans taught us. He doesn't mean that they taught him. He worked all this out before, but he means he taught us, the French, how to turn the idea of democratic republicanism into something beginning to approach reality. He's thinking about Pennsylvania, where, of course, they did in 1770s. He was very keen on the Tom Paine and what was achieved in Pennsylvania in 1776, where, in contrast to the other American states, of course, they did adopt universal male suffrage and a democratic constitution already. That was reversed again in the 1790s, and there's a whole battle going on within the American Revolution of democratic republicanism versus aristocratic republicanism, but that's another story for another evening. But Brissot was the closest ally of Condorcet in promoting democratic republicanism in France, and Brissot and Condorcet together were the closest allies of the Jeffersonians and of Tom Paine, of the people in America who were trying to advance democratic republicanism against the Hamiltons and John Adamses and Gouverneur Morrises and so on, who were fighting for the right way to run America is aristocratic republicanism. That's what most of the founding fathers thought. But there was a split, and the more radical ones were very much in alliance with Brissot and with Condorcet. And these are also the gentlemen who start the movement for black, the Amis des Noirs movement in 1788 was set up by Brissot and Condorcet. The idea of black emancipation was more or less argued for along the same sort of lines and the same kind of principles, universal and equal rights, as they were arguing for Jewish emancipation. So again, here you see how Jewish emancipation is part of a much wider picture, that the whole social system and theological underpinning of the social system and the whole political framework attached to that social system, which characterize Ancien Regime Europe, the whole thing has to be overthrown. It's a sort of revolutionary consciousness that develops just before the revolution, but which is to play a very major part in the French Revolution. And Brissot and Condorcet are the two most important architects, I would say, of this democratic republicanism, which is why Robespierre hated them so much. A lot of historians of the French Revolution are a little bit cagey about saying, actually there were two different factions of republicans in France once the monarchists were defeated, and one lot were democratic and the other lot were populist authoritarian, and Robespierre and his friends, the populist authoritarians, won the battle in the end in June 1793. But they forget to, everyone knows about how lots of aristocratic and royal and clerical heads were cut off, which I'm not saying we shouldn't think about that, but it is important to mention that, okay, the aristocrats are terrible, but first, the people who disagree with us are, in fact, contradicting what the common man, what the ordinary people really want. So they're even worse. Brissot and Condorcet, these intellectuals, they're very anti-intellectual, Robespierre. These people should be guillotined before anyone else. And they were. Almost all of them, or all the ones they could catch, were guillotined first because they're worse than the aristocrats and royalists, because the Democrats, the freedom of the press, I mean, once the common people take power, argues Robespierre and his friends, there's only one right way of thinking. So what do you want all these different newspapers for? There were hundreds in Paris by 1793. Freedom of the press? Absolutely not. We have to suppress that. And these people are creating all the wrong values with their, and with their intellectualism and so on. So off with their heads. So they were all murdered by Robespierre before very long, but nevertheless their historic role and their role in Jewish emancipation is enormously important. Now, this review of Brissot's was read in England, France, and across the Atlantic in the Sephardic communities of the Caribbean, in Suriname, and where it has special resonance. And it initiated a French debate that was to culminate in the general emancipation of French Jewry during the Revolution in September 1791. He also published an English version of Dohm's tract on civil emancipation, and in these reviews, he's warmly agreeing with Dohm and Mendelssohn, but he seems to have a special enthusiasm for the point that the defects of Jewish society were for the argument that what was wrong with Jewish society, its defects, were principally the fault of Christian society, the churches, and the theological underpinning of institutions and laws. So Brissot, in effect, widened and to some degree manipulated Dohm's argument by more heavily emphasizing the alleged defects, culpability, and oppressiveness of Christian society, and directly connecting the problem of the Jews and of the Jewish situation in Europe with what he saw as the need to emancipate a whole range of oppressed groups, as I say, not least the blacks and mulattoes, and especially the need for a general regeneration of mankind. In other words, Roederer, I haven't said anything about Roederer yet. He's another ally of Condorcet and Brissot. So let me say rather Brissot and Roederer approached the Jewish problem specifically from the perspective of the Radical Enlightenment. So once again, you see just how Radical Enlightenment is a key to understanding the Enlightenment as a whole, to understanding the Great Transformation, which is one of the biggest transformations in the history of the West, but absolutely fundamental to understanding modern Jewish history. So if you're not talking Radical Enlightenment, and especially if you're of Jewish background yourself, you've lost the key to one of the most important transitions in the history of our modernity. It really is fundamentally important. And so Brissot minimized all talk of Jewish incapacity, defects, racial characteristics. For him, the point of discussing Jewish rights was precisely to underline Christian oppression and the general defectiveness of French and all Ancien regime society, the intolerable weight of a generalized monarchical, aristocratic, and ecclesiastical tyranny. Brissot's solution was that the Jews should be at once endowed with exactly the same status, eligibility, and rights as other men. Where Dohm proposed a drastic widening of the range of occupations open to Jews, Dohm did not suggest that they should also be eligible for public office and exercising authority over Christians. That might be going a bit too far, he thought. But eager to weaken the Christian dimension of Western society as much as possible, Brissot had no hesitation in saying there's no reason why Jews should not hold public office, whatever. Now, in faraway Suriname, it's quite impressive how intensive the response to Dohm's pamphlet, to Brissot's pamphlet, and the whole debate, and to Mendelssohn, and to discussion of what was going on in Germany, in Austria, and in France. They got really excited about it in Jordan-Savannah. That was the Sephardic center up the river from Paramaribo in Suriname. And there's David Nassi, whose dates I give just above there, is actually one of the most interesting Jewish radicals and radical enlighteners of the late 18th century. And he makes some very strong criticisms of the Dutch Ancien regime and of the limitations that the Dutch Republic, as it was before 1795, which excluded many groups, in fact all groups, if you didn't belong to the Dutch Reformed Church, so if you were a Catholic or if you were a dissenting Protestant or a Jew, you were automatically excluded from public office and from higher military command and from participation in politics and so on. He's very critical of all those things. But at the same time, you see, I mentioned just now that once you begin proclaiming universal and equal rights, the injustice of the exclusions that are being applied to Jewish society and push for access for Jews to the legal profession, something he was particularly concerned with in Dutch Suriname, he at the same time got into a battle with the local rabbis who began to see that what he was doing was weakening their control over the Jewish community. So it becomes a kind of double-headed conflict, even in Suriname, as well as in Austria, in Prague, and in Germany. These are two, he's not as well known as he should be either in the Jewish world. These are two of his this is his most famous work in its French edition and in its Dutch edition. The most important book published in colonial Suriname was the history of the colony, and he was the main author of this history, although his name is not there on the title page. And it's also the most important book ever published in Paramaribo. I don't think there were all that many important books published in Paramaribo, but that was certainly the most important one. Yeah, just to show you the map of Suriname. It is really quite remarkable that this whole debate in Germany and France should be replicated here in such a lively fashion, but it seemed very, very relevant to them, and they became passionately involved in it. Nazi is interesting also in an American context, the United States context, because he's the first. He was a failed sugar planter. He was a failed businessman who later on became a physician, and a very capable one. He is the first Jewish member of the Philosophical Society of Philadelphia. He was made a member of the Philosophical Society of Philadelphia in 1796. And his main text, which is very little known in the Jewish world or general world, I think because of its rarity, it just hasn't been read by very many scholars, but the Lettre politico-theologico-morale sur les Juifs is certainly in the first place an attack on the Ancien regime for denying Jews access to most occupations and areas of activity. But it is also, certainly by implication, a criticism of the narrowness of Jewish life and education as presided over by the rabbis. And there are one or two comments which are really quite suggestive. He, for instance, doesn't think that Spinoza and Uriel da Costa should have been expelled from the community in Amsterdam in the 17th century. And he makes the curious remark that they wouldn't have become atheists if the rabbis hadn't expelled them. Anyway, that's David Nasi. Now, I want to come to Amsterdam for a moment, because I think the Dutch situation, which is not so well, I mean, most highly literate Jews and Jewish intellectuals and readers who have a reasonably good knowledge of Jewish history and know about Moses Mendelssohn and Jewish emancipation and the Haskalah and the new developments in the 18th century, but they usually don't know about the Dutch aspects of this, and I think they're rather important. This is a 17th century painting showing you that's the Sephardic, the Portuguese synagogue on the right, and on the left in the middle there's the Ashkenazic Great Synagogue. But it's really very revealing, I think, that the situation in Holland developed in a way which you might find rather surprising. And so I'd like to just explain that in the latter part of the lecture. So it's perhaps the hardest part of this whole subject for a modern audience, and perhaps especially a Jewish audience, to understand. Jewish emancipation in the late 18th century was not only comprehensively opposed by most people, most enlighteners, most churchmen, and most governments, it was also comprehensively opposed by most Jews and Jewish communities, and by no means only in Eastern Europe and in Prague, which I mentioned the condemnation of Moses Mendelssohn there, but also in Western Europe. This is because it would mean a serious reduction in religious, that is in rabbinic authority, and in the community elders' control. So again, it was about power, community control, and rabbinism, but not perhaps something inherent in the core of Judaism as a religious tradition. So I want to separate Jewish tradition as community organization and rabbinic supervision of Jewish life from Jewish religious tradition as such, because I think, and Mendelssohn would have been the first to point this out, I think those two things become noticeably distinct at this crucial juncture in the late 18th century. Now, the most interesting Jewish revolutionary in Holland in the 1790s. Of course, the French once the French Revolution got going, it started to expand into other European countries, and the Rhineland was overrun in 1792, and then in 1790 went to and backwards and forwards a bit for a couple of years, but in 1794 the French got a stronger hold, first on Belgium, and started to invade the southern part of Holland and all of the Netherlands, despite the very strenuous British efforts to help the Dutch stadtholder and the Orangists defend the Netherlands against the revolutionaries. The revolution is strongly supported, I must say, by most of Dutch opinion at that point in 1795, succeeded in taking over the country. However, there was plenty of anti-Semitism in Holland, and one of the paradoxes of the Dutch Revolution, the Batavian Revolution as it's called in 1795, is that the Jewish community had a tradition of being supporters of the Prince of Orange and of Britain against France, and therefore of aristocratic systems against, now in this revolutionary context, against democratic republicanism. And there was quite a lot of, Amsterdam had a 11% Jewish population. Amsterdam had a much bigger Jewish presence than any other Western European city. And the very major divisions in Jewish opinion appeared almost immediately, and in the Jewish role. There were actually a lot of brawls and fights in Amsterdam, and the public, non-Jewish Dutch opinion took the view that the Jews were siding with Orangism against the revolution. Now, the most interesting, I think, a long biography about him appeared a couple of years ago, Hartog de Hartog Limon, not a very well-known figure outside the Netherlands, but very interesting, I think, because leading the revolutionary tendency, was a very strong Republican and Democrat, and a great champion of universal and equal rights, very much a radical enlightenment. Well, he was a doctor too, like Nazi, and none of the other Jewish physicians in Holland were so much interested or gave as much time and effort for health care for poor people as he did. He was very much involved with that effort, which is another interesting part of his personality. Now, among the first revolutionary moves of those Jews like Hartog de Hartog Limon, who was supporting the revolution, was to set up a separate, the supposedly enlightened Dutch societies and clubs that you had in the country before 1795 all excluded Jews. So even what were supposed to be Enlightenment reading societies and societies set up for the promotion of the Enlightenment, these were moderate Enlightenment. Moderate Enlightenment meant compromise with the theological, with the social stratifications and the theological underpinning of the past. What that meant in Holland was that even the Felix Meritis, the most famous Enlightenment club in Holland, based in Amsterdam, you don't admit Jews because they don't belong in what is essentially a Christian society. Enlightenment, or their conception of Enlightenment, moderate Enlightenment is a Christian Enlightenment, they said, and so Jews are not admitted. So what the enlightened Jews and supporters of Moses Mendelssohn, etc., had to do was to set up their own club. Could I ask how many more minutes? When should I stop? In another? I should stop now. Okay. I just want to. So let me just finish with a couple of main points to conclude, and just show the rest of the slides quickly. But the point I want to make here is that only a minority of Jewish opinion joined Hartog Limon and was sympathetic to this Enlightenment club of the Jewish pro-revolution intellectuals, which was called Felix Libertate, it's his Latin title, set up in Amsterdam. And they were the ones who were fighting for Jewish emancipation, universal and equal rights, and access to all the professions. And they were so strenuously opposed by not all the rabbis, there was one exception, by most of the rabbis and by most of the conservative Jewish opinion in Holland, that a complete formal split set in from 1796. It began when he persuaded the Amsterdam City Council to publish the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in Yiddish, and put these Yiddish posters up on all the school, institutional and synagogue doors in Amsterdam. And this started a war within the community in Amsterdam and the Jewish communities in Holland generally. And is a very interesting split. And it led to a schism and a new Orthodox community. It wasn't particularly a Reformed community, though it did adjust 1 or 2 points. But they set up a separate Jewish community, which we know it had like 600 or 700 members, but that was still a relatively small minority, given that there were something like 20,000 Jews in Amsterdam. Let's say 1,000 joined this organization, but it was certainly a small, this new synagogue. But the Jewish secessionists who supported the revolution and Jewish emancipation and Jewish rights were actually a minority of Dutch Jewry, and I think one has to accept that that was the case. Okay, I'll just now wrap up with, now another one who was very keen on Moses Mendelssohn, very keen on Dohm, thought Dohm's pamphlet was terrific. Jewish emancipation was a marvelous idea. The Jews are just the same as everything else, everyone else. There's nothing, if there are defects in Jewish society and an over-concentration on trade, that's entirely the fault of the churches, nobody else's fault. This Mirabeau, another of the great leaders of the French Revolution, is very keen on exactly the same points. So that is now, this is the Radical Enlightenment really getting firmly entrenched in French revolutionary consciousness. But as I say, French revolutionary consciousness doesn't mean after 1789. I'm talking about revolutionary conscious before 1789. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been any 1789. How can there have been a Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen unless people like Mirabeau were not talking about universal and equal rights in 1787? It's absolutely absurd to talk about, oh, well, there was a financial crisis in the French monarchy and things got out of hand in 1789 and gradually the revolution took hold. That's a very silly way of explaining what the revolution was in terms of a transformation of consciousness and ideas. You have to start with what people were saying by way of the need to get rid of the old ways of thinking and replace them with completely new ways of thinking before 1789 to understand the force of what happened in 1789. So the revolutionary vanguard don't just suddenly appear out of nowhere in 1789. They're the people who are writing these things before 1789. Now, there was, I should just end on this point. Here is Metz, and in Metz there was the Royal Academy in 1785, 6 and 7, held a very famous competition, and this competition was what would make the question, it was an essay prize competition that they initiated, which attracted a lot of attention. What would make the Jews happier and more useful in France? And eventually, after a lot of discussion, they made three different essays, equal prize winners. One was the famous Henri Grégoire, one was a local lawyer. But the third win, there's Grégoire and his essay on the regeneration of the Jews. But I wanted to just end by saying but one of the most interesting Jewish revolutionaries of all was one of these three contestants and one of the three prize winners. And his prize essay was then published in the same year as the beginning of the French Revolution, 1789. And here's another person who deserves to be better known than he is, though there is a good biography available in English by Francis Molino. Salkin Horwitz, who was a Polish Jew who couldn't even speak French properly when he first got a job in Paris. He'd been wandering around for a while and leading a rather destitute life, but he knew a lot of languages, and he got a job as translating Hebrew at the Royal Library in Paris and became quite a significant person. And in August 1788, he becomes joint winner of the Metz Royal Academy Prize Contest, jointly with this lawyer and with the Abbé Grégoire. And he repeats all the usual arguments. So the defects of Jewish society are the fault of the churches. The Jews are the same as everybody else. They're Jews they're men first and Jews second. That there shouldn't be any restrictions or exclusions or disabilities applying to the Jews. But he brings a delicious East European Polish Jewish humor to his essay, which is absolutely great. Makes a lot of jokes, which the others don't make. And, and he really is a marvelous figure. And it was quite a brave one, too, because later on he published a couple of articles in papers when the Robespierre people were taking over, attacking them, which was very, very courageous. They left him alone. I mean, usually one of Robespierre's rules, a little bit like Mr. Putin, no criticism is allowed. If you criticize Robespierre, you probably lost your head. He didn't lose his, but he was quite brave in a couple of things that he was said, even in 1793, 1794. So he's a great Jewish revolutionary, Selkin Horvitz, and a Jewish radical enlightener. So that's what I want to end with. And he's very Polish and a real Polish Jew. His humor is absolutely, many people here would recognize it immediately and enjoy it. It makes lots of jokes. But it's a real radical enlightenment from a Jewish angle. And although it is very hostile to the churches and to Ancien Regime society, it's also very critical and hostile of the way the rabbis and the existing oligarchies who control Jewish community life, the way they behave and lead Jewish life is also a major subject of his criticism. And with that, I will end. Thank you.